During one of Fu's rare proactive phone calls, I heard a woman's voice saying, "Come help me zip my skirt." Fu quickly ended the call without any explanation. The voice belonged to Serafina, an intern at Fu's workplace. Her voice was charming, with a natural and pleasant tone. Judging by Fu's reaction, it was obvious this wasn't the first time such a situation had occurred. In the past, I might have convinced myself that this was just part of his work. However, staring at the text message about a hotel booking in Rivertown, I found it increasingly hard to ignore the details forming a pattern. Rivertown wasn't the city Fu had mentioned for his business trip. When I received Fu's call, I almost questioned whether I had misunderstood. After all, he rarely called me of his own accord, especially during work trips. Once I verified I wasn't mistaken, I rubbed my aching back and answered the phone, feeling a tinge of happiness. "Gwendolyn, what are you doing?" Fu asked in his usual steady tone. After 3 years of dating and 4 years of marriage, I could detect the faintest traces of unease in his voice. My excitement dimmed slightly, replaced by mild confusion. "I just finished cleaning the house," I replied. Fu was particular about cleanliness, and the house needed a deep clean weekly. But since he disliked having others in his space and was busy with work, the responsibility always fell on me. "How's your trip? Have you received any suspicious text messages? There have been a lot of scams lately, so be careful," I added, concerned. Before I could finish, Fu interrupted me with an abrupt remark about text message fraud. His sudden shift in topic felt random, and I realized he didn't seem genuinely interested in what I had been doing. An inexplicable sense of disappointment crept in. Over time, it felt as if the distance between us had grown wider. Fu was perpetually occupied with work, spending two-thirds of his time on business trips. I had made many attempts to bridge the gap, surprising him, showing care, and even trying to involve myself in his social circles. But he was uncooperative or outright resistant, leaving my efforts fruitless. I glanced at the message Fu had mentioned and found a new one from 5 minutes ago. It contained a reservation for a hotel in Rivertown, the city Fu hadn't mentioned visiting. My heart skipped a beat as an uneasy suspicion surfaced. On the other end of the line, Fu continued probing with urgency, but I responded negatively. His apparent relief was palpable, yet he double-checked as if to confirm my answer. Remaining calm, I stared at the freshly changed black bedding Fu liked, replying, "There's nothing there." "That's fine, I'll get back to work," Fu replied. Suddenly, a sweet female voice came through the phone saying, "Come help me zip my skirt." Fu abruptly fell silent, and by the time I regained my composure, the call had ended. The screen dimmed, yet the unfamiliar voice echoed in my mind. What kind of relationship would allow a woman to so naturally ask Fu for such a favor? The realization hit me. Fu's strange call was a test, born out of guilt. Though it felt rash to jump to conclusions, his recent behavior was too peculiar to ignore. My thoughts spiraled as memories surfaced. 2 weeks ago, Fu gave me a black and red bag I disliked. It brought back painful childhood memories of being sent to live with my grandmother after my parents' divorce. Back then, village children tormented me with gruesome pranks, leaving me haunted by nightmares of black and blood red. Last week, Fu gifted me jasmine-scented perfume, though he knew I was allergic to alcohol. It used to be that Fu noticed such details, yet now, something had shifted. At first, seeing the hotel booking made me happy. In our early days of dating, we were inseparable, sharing every aspect of our lives, even linking all our apps. Marriage had brought a desire for personal space, so when Fu relinked the apps, I thought it was a clumsy but sincere gesture of reconciliation. However, his nervous demeanor suggested otherwise. The text wasn't a token of goodwill, but a sign of another woman's presence. Were the recent gifts acts of compensation or deliberate humiliation? I stood frozen, staring out the window at the wintry scene. Had I packed warm clothes for Fu? He was prone to colds in the cold season, and I felt a strange need to bring him some clothing. Clinging to that flimsy excuse, I booked a flight to Rivertown. Before leaving, I noticed the green, succulent Fu and I had planted together. Once a small plant, it had grown large over 7 years of care. Normally, I would move it indoors to shield it from the cold, but I no longer had the energy. As I descended the stairs, I crossed paths with Kipe, a former friend who lived nearby. I started to greet her, but her indifferent expression stopped me. She bowed her head slightly and moved aside to let me pass. Kipe and I had once been close. She was 2 years my junior and now a successful lawyer. Our falling out came when I chose to abandon my dream of a permanent position at a law firm to follow Fu. She had accused me of breaking my promise to mentor her and warned me I'd regret my choice. At the hotel mentioned in the text, I arrived just as Fu exited the main entrance. He wore a pink coat I'd never seen before, walking hand in hand with Serafina. She leaned close, slipping her hand into his coat pocket, their expressions radiating an intimacy that stung. Standing amid the bustling crowd, I felt a wave of bitterness as they disappeared into the night. The image of Fu in his pink coat clashed with a memory of him refusing to wear colors other than black, white, or gray. It reminded me of my 22nd birthday, when he had grudgingly donned a camel coat I had chosen. That day, I was wearing it as everyone around teased Fu, stuffing clothes into his arms and joking that I was too lenient with him. Watching him with a mix of unease and anticipation, I felt a wave of relief and sweetness when he finally took the coat. I admit to a childish wish to flaunt, to make everyone see how special I was in his eyes. But in the next moment, he slammed the freshly ironed camel-colored coat onto the table, his impatient voice breaking the moment. "Gwendolyn, can you stop being so immature?" he said. The room fell silent, and surprised glances flickered between us. Staring at the scene, I froze as the coat was marred by visible stains from drinks and snacks on the table. Tears welled up in my eyes, and I couldn't help feeling aggrieved. I hadn't forced him to accept it. Any excuse, like disliking the color or feeling too warm, would have sufficed. Why did he have to handle it in such a humiliating way? Determined, I held his gaze, seeking an explanation, but Fu frowned and looked away, saying nothing. The next day, he apologized, blaming alcohol for his behavior, and the matter was dropped. Over the years, his preference for simple colors never wavered, no matter the occasion. Now it seemed there was no rule he couldn't break, except for me being the one to inspire the change. Following them from afar, I saw Fu pause to buy a flower from a child. He carefully chose a vibrant pink lily from among the wilted stems and handed it to Serafina. Her response wasn't to take the flower, but to hug him with bright, sparkling eyes. The lily suited her perfectly, her radiant smile making the flower seem less impressive. They went to play a claw machine game, where Serafina spent a considerable amount without success. Then, like a hero swooping in, Fu effortlessly retrieved the teddy bear she had wanted most, holding it aloft and cheekily demanding a reward. Serafina obliged, kissing him lightly on the cheek, and Fu flushed like a bashful teenager. The two wandered down the lively streets, sharing a skewer of candied fruit, writing their names on a fogged window pane. I couldn't deny how in love they seemed. Their simple gestures, holding hands, hugging, exuded a sweetness that made their bond seem impenetrable. It reminded me of the happy times I had shared with Fu when he had been willing to show care. Back then, he made an effort in every way. During winter, he rose early to prepare me a hot, varied breakfast. Aware of his sensitive stomach, he had secretly bought a soy milk maker in the dorms and researched recipes to ensure he ate healthily. Before every date, he prepared thoughtful gifts, a flower or snack he enjoyed. We studied together, saved for trips, explored new foods, admired unfamiliar places, and remembered every detail of our shared experiences. He used to tell me I was beautiful and remind me to lift my head. Loving someone like that made it impossible not to reciprocate. But over time, the deeper my love grew, the less I understood how to express it. I slowed my steps, losing sight of them. A bitter taste lingered in my mouth as I turned toward my reflection in a store window, noticing tears streaming down my face. Watching Fu and Serafina disappear into the hotel's entrance was enough. I no longer felt the need to confront them. Tonight's events had already given me the answers I sought. Surprisingly, after the initial shock, I felt no intense emotion. Perhaps I had anticipated this, or maybe years of indifference had numbed me. In the quiet chat box, I attached a photo of Fu holding Serafina's hand and typed, "Fu, let's talk." I recalled hearing once that asking why in a failed relationship was foolish. Yet, I wanted answers. Why had Fu stopped caring about my feelings? Why did he give me a bag and perfume that ignored my emotional wounds and physical allergies? Why had he truly betrayed our relationship? I remembered the winter nights when we held hands, shared warm drinks, and watched fireworks together, our fingers intertwined in coat pockets. The warmth from our shared body heat had once spread to our hearts. When had all that love faded? It wasn't that I expected perfection in our marriage or blinded myself to his betrayal. I just wanted closure after 7 years. "Gwendolyn, what are you doing here alone?" A familiar yet distant voice startled me. Letting go of my phone, I watched it fall to the ground as I turned toward the sound. It was Kipe, dragging a suitcase, likely for a business trip. Forcing a smile, I opened my mouth to respond, but it faltered. Instead, Kipe turned to her colleague, whispered something, and walked toward me. "Have you been crying?" she asked gently, bending slightly, her voice filled with concern. I instinctively touched my face but felt only cold, dry skin. "No," I replied. "But your face says otherwise," she insisted, and suddenly, my eyes filled with tears. I knew I wasn't in the best state. Before leaving, I had sprayed the perfume Fu gave me, which irritated my skin with its high alcohol content. I hadn't eaten all day, felt weak, and the cold wind had left my hair in disarray. Without a mirror, I could imagine how I looked. I wanted to act indifferent, as if Fu's betrayal didn't affect me, but deep down, I couldn't let go. Hesitating, I stayed silent, staring at the unsent message on my phone. It's embarrassing to cry in front of Kipe, I thought, avoiding her gaze. Before I could hide, she pulled me into a warm embrace. That simple gesture broke the dam of emotions I had been holding back. I whimpered as tears streamed uncontrollably, Kipe's hand patting my back. Though her touch couldn't warm me through my coat, her kindness thawed a part of the cold I felt inside. A deep warmth spread through me as I let go of all resistance and collapsed into Kipe's arms like she was a lifeline, pouring out my feelings. I told her that Fu used to be so kind and loving, but had become too preoccupied to reciprocate my affection. "I've asked for so little," I said, "so why don't you even care about me?" Kipi didn't release me and listened intently as I rambled incoherently. "Gwendolyn, love and being busy aren't opposites," she said gently. "You're a good person who remembers every small gesture he's made. But people change, often without reason. Do you love Fu, or do you love the memories of who he was?" My voice grew hoarse until I could barely speak, and all I could do was whisper, "I'm sorry," over and over. Some of my apology was for Kipi, but most of it was directed at my past self. I wasn't sure how things had reached this point. Exhausted from venting, I lacked the energy to make sense of my situation, but I was grateful Kipi was there. I ate the seafood porridge she had prepared beforehand, almost on autopilot, and then took a warm, soothing bath. My tense body and frayed nerves began to relax, allowing me to reflect on what to do about Fu. Kipi remarked that I had a habit of overthinking, and I couldn't deny the truth in her words. Over the years, I had endured Fu's increasingly cold and distant behavior. It wasn't just because of love, but also because I couldn't face admitting I'd made a mistake in choosing him. When we married, Fu's apathy had already begun to show, but I deliberately ignored it. In hindsight, it was clear I'd been punishing myself through this futile attachment. However, Kipi's embrace and her comforting words had sparked a change. I realized I didn't need to keep making things hard for myself. I had made mistakes in this relationship, but they were only against myself and those who cared about me. As for Fu, his constant coldness and now his betrayal left no room for forgiveness. With this clarity, I decided on my next steps. Divorce was inevitable. Yet simply ending things wouldn't be enough for Fu. He deserved consequences. Kipi seemed to agree. She took my hand as we walked through the hotel corridor, led by a staff member who looked nervous about potential trouble. Behind us followed three tall, muscular colleagues of Kipi. Our group moved purposefully toward Fu's room. Watching Kipi's resolute expression, I felt fortunate to have her by my side. We reached Fu's room in about 5 minutes. Stopping the staff member from knocking, I stepped forward and raised my hand to do it myself. Glancing back at Kipi, I caught an expression that was both encouraging and slightly anxious. It seemed she feared I might back out at the last moment. Her earlier words whispered in my mind, "After our fight, I didn't want to accept your compromise. But seeing you so hurt now, I regret it." When the door opened, Serafina stood there in a bathrobe, her wet hair still dripping. She clearly recognized me and seemed to attempt a smug smile, but it froze on her face when she noticed the formidable crowd behind me. Her expression became comical in its awkwardness. "Sister Gwendolyn, what are you doing here?" she asked stiffly, stepping back and trying to shut the door. Kipi's colleagues, however, had no intention of letting that happen. They easily blocked her attempt and barged in. For a moment, I felt like I was the one causing trouble, but I pushed the thought aside. Smiling faintly, I asked, "Where's Fu?" Serafina remained silent, her expression strained, but the sound of running water from the bathroom answered my question. One of Kipi's male colleagues strode purposefully to the bathroom, opened the door without hesitation, and stepped inside. Moments later, Fu's panicked and angry voice echoed out. In less than a minute, the bathroom door reopened. Fu stumbled out, drenched, wearing a hastily thrown-on bathrobe. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he shouted. His rant was abruptly cut off as I slapped him, my hands stinging from the impact. Speaking calmly, I said, "Fu, is this what you call a business trip? What kind of work involves shopping with Serafina so intimately and sharing a room? Has your company fallen to such a state?" Fu froze, his face stiff with embarrassment. A bright red handprint marked his cheek as shame, anger, and guilt flickered across his face. I stared at him, taking in his disheveled appearance, before finally stating my purpose. "Fu, I can't stay with a man like you anymore. I want a divorce." Without waiting for a reply, I turned and left. As we reached the hotel lobby, I paused to look through the large French windows. Snow was falling softly outside, and a leafless tree stood at the entrance. At its top, a faint hint of green was barely visible, but it seemed insignificant against the pure white backdrop. Watching it for a while made me feel even more drained. As I stepped toward the exit, I stopped and took a deep breath. "Kipi, thank you for today," I said hesitantly. The atmosphere grew heavier as the words hung in the air. Gratitude between Kipi and me had always been rare, and now, with emotions subdued, I wasn't sure how to act around her. Kipi appeared equally uneasy, but quickly shifted the subject. "The man who pulled Fu out earlier is Leander, a divorce lawyer from my firm," she said. I recalled Leander, a towering man nearly 1.9 meters tall with a solid build. It was no wonder Fu had been easily overpowered. Perhaps due to his professional experience, Leander seemed unfazed by the situation. However, as Kippy and I stood there, she seemed to become aware of the delicate shift in our dynamic. Her tone was firm but carried an unmistakable note of care. Her words seemed to unravel all the knots in my heart. "Could you share his contact information with me?" I asked, stepping closer and giving her a genuine smile. Kipi appeared taken aback, leaning back slightly before realizing her reaction, and freezing in place. As she glanced at my smile, she opened her mouth but could only utter a faint sound of agreement. Watching her struggle, more flustered than I was, I finally laughed. Without saying another word, I took another step forward and hugged Kipi. She seemed completely unprepared for the gesture, stiffening in my arms like a piece of wood. After a brief hesitation, I felt her grip tighten as she returned the embrace. Since that night, Fu had not reached out in person, but his previously cold, brief messages were replaced by long, emotional pleas. He claimed he had lost control of his temper, begged for forgiveness, and reminisced about our happy times together. His words were filled with desperation, as if trying to salvage the marriage on the verge of collapse. Yet, neither his seemingly heartfelt apologies nor the memories of our past could stir any emotion in me. However, his admission of guilt wasn't entirely useless. It simplified the divorce process. My discussions with Lysander went smoothly. My requests were straightforward. I wanted my rightful share of the settlement. While gathering evidence with Lysander, I found answers about the perfume and the bag. Unsurprisingly, both had been chosen with Serafina present. What I had initially believed to be thoughtful surprises had been hollow gestures, tainted by another woman's involvement. When I finally learned the truth, I felt no sadness, only a strange numbness. The day I signed the divorce papers, I saw Fu again. We met in a small cafe where he was already seated by the window. The light streaming in made him appear pale, and as I approached, I realized it wasn't an illusion. He looked thinner, his face gaunt, with an unkempt beard and dark circles under his eyes. When he noticed me, his gaze flickered uneasily. I sat across from him and broke the silence. "Go on. What did you want to say?" Fu hesitated, looking pitiful and unsure. I had rarely seen him so vulnerable. In the past, I might have felt sorry for him, softened, or even changed the topic to make things easier for him. But now, all I felt was impatience. This meeting was unnecessary, and it was Fu who had insisted on it. Sensing my mood, he finally stopped stalling. "Gwendolyn, I know I was wrong. I've ended things with Serafina. She deliberately seduced me. Can't you forgive me just this once?" he said, his tone pleading. Hearing him list Serafina's faults caught me off guard. Given how they had behaved, I had expected him to take at least some responsibility. Instead, he genuinely seemed to believe his excuses. I hadn't thought he could stoop lower than cheating. But his attempt to blame someone else proved otherwise. I cut him off mid-sentence. Do you honestly think cheating just happens? You're really going to pin this all on her? My voice rose with disbelief, drawing stares from people around us. Fu looked rattled, as though I had struck a nerve. Gwendolyn, we didn't do anything too extreme, he stammered. Seeing his panic, he continued quickly. Do you have to be so heartless? Don't you share any blame for how things turned out? His self-righteousness left me speechless. My first instinct was to laugh. My fault? Did I force you to cheat? Did I push you into another woman's arms? I snapped. Fu squirmed under my sharp questioning, especially as the whispers of nearby patrons grew louder. But you can't be so cruel and ignore everything we've been through, he protested. At that moment, I realized why he had insisted on meeting. The terms of the divorce settlement, thanks to Lysander, were overwhelmingly in my favor. Fu had hoped to change my mind. You don't think the asset division is fair, do you? I asked, watching his reaction closely. Fu hesitated, then nodded quickly, as if grasping at a lifeline. I smirked. Shall we settle it in court? I said slowly, letting the words sink in. His face turned ashen. As the party at fault, Fu had no advantage legally, and he knew it. In the end, he reluctantly signed the agreement. As I left, I sent a recording of Fu's accusations against Serafina to her. How she would react was no longer my concern. Although I felt no lingering attachment to Fu, I couldn't forgive Serafina's actions either. Outside the cafe, I was surprised to find Kipi waiting for me. Leaning casually against her car, she looked like the friend I remembered from university, before either of us had experienced any of this turmoil. Back then, we often waited for each other just like this, ready to head off together. Seeing me approach, she opened the passenger door without a word. Now, what are you planning to do next? She asked as I buckled my seatbelt. The question made me pause, and I found myself thinking about the succulents on my balcony. After 7 years of care, they had withered in the winter wind, their leaves turning yellow. I should clean the house first, I said quietly. I don't want Fu's things lingering there. Truthfully, I hadn't thought much about the future. My silence seemed to give Kippy the wrong impression. With a soft click, she withdrew her hand from the seatbelt, sat upright, and avoided my eyes. I heard my firm is hiring new lawyers, she said casually. Her words made warmth bloom in my chest. Meeting her expectant gaze, I felt hope for the first time in a while. The thought of working alongside Kippy, a dream I had often imagined, seemed closer to reality. I heard about Fu again when I started at the law firm. He and Serafina had a very public falling out at work. Their fight was so disruptive that Serafina's internship ended abruptly, and Fu was fired for personal reasons. The news barely registered. For the past 3 months, I had poured myself into preparing for my return to the workplace. The days were busy but fulfilling, and without realizing it, winter had passed. One morning, as spring began to thaw the world, I stood in front of a mirror to check my appearance. Though I believed in my abilities, the idea of returning made me nervous. Kipi, waiting patiently, approached as I adjusted my outfit. Leaning in, she placed a watch on my wrist, adjusting the strap with care. I blinked in surprise, but before I could ask, she smiled knowingly. This was meant to be a gift for you. Luckily, it's still in style. The cold metal began to warm against my skin. Looking up at Kippy, I saw sincerity in her eyes as she said, Gwendolyn, welcome back to yourself. I couldn't explain what I felt, only that my heart swelled and my eyes misted. Without hesitation, I stepped forward and hugged Kippy tightly. She returned the embrace, letting my tears fall onto her shoulder. When I first received the signed divorce papers, I felt satisfaction at Fu's loss. But it didn't bring relief, only a strange emptiness. Over time, that void became a window into a brighter world, one full of life. Now, I finally had the peace and confidence to step into it.